신재훈 과장입니다. 우리나라를 비롯한 미국의 주요 교역국들은 8월 1일 상호관세 부과 시한을 앞두고 협상 타결에 총력을 기울이고 있습니다. 또 자동차, 철강, 알루미늄 등에 대한 무역확장법 232조 관세 부과가 발표된 데 이어 최근에는 반도체 의약품에 대한 관세 부과가 예고되고 폴리실리콘 등에 대한 232조 조사가 개시되는 등 품목별 관세 부과도 확대되고 있습니다. 한 치 앞을 내다볼 수 없는 통상 환경에서 우리 기업의 기회 요인은 어디에 있는지 트럼프 일기 행정부에서 통상 참모를 지냈던 로펌 킹앤스펠딩의 스티븐 본 파트너님을 모시고 이야기해 보겠습니다.
Good morning, Mr. Wong. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. We truly appreciate your participation in our KOTRA TV channel. Our Korean SME audience is keen to understand how they should respond to the trade policies of a second Trump administration and where potential opportunities may lie for them. To begin, would you provide a brief introduction of yourself, including your professional background and the role you played during the first Trump administration?
Yes, so my name is Stephen Vaughn. I'm a trade lawyer here in Washington, D.C. For most of the last 25 years, I've been practicing trade law. Between 2000 and 2016, I was at Skadden Arps, and I worked for a man named Bob Lighthizer. In 2016, after President Trump got elected, he decided to appoint Mr. Lighthizer as the U.S. Trade Representative. He asked me if I wanted to be the General Counsel of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and I did that. So from January 2017 to April of 2019, I was the U.S. General Counsel to the Office of U.S. Trade. The Chief of Staff in that administration was a guy named Jameson Greer, and I had worked with him previously as well. So, and then I left and went to King&Spalding, and Jameson came to King&Spalding in March of 2020. And so we worked together for the last 4 years. And Jameson is now the U.S. Trade Representative. So we do have some experience in talking with these folks.
Okay. The reciprocal tariffs announced in April and further notified through letters to certain countries in July are scheduled to take effect on August 1st. How do you foresee this move impacting global trade flows?
I think, so far, I think over time, what it'll do is it will make it slightly more difficult for countries to offshore jobs in the United States. I think it will lead to somewhat more employment in the U.S. and somewhat higher wages in the U.S. as Americans will be more competitive in global markets. So I think it'll be generally favorable from a U.S. perspective.
Section 232 tariffs have already been imposed on items such as automobiles and steel, and there are discussions of extending them to copper, pharmaceuticals, and more. In your view, what other products or industries might be considered for future tariff measures?
So right now they are conducting a number of Section 232 investigations. They just announced the proposed tariffs on copper. The president has talked already about doing something on pharmaceuticals. They have ongoing investigations on timber, lumber, and wood products. They have one on semiconductors and other electronic goods. They have one on aviation. I think, we could see others depending on, usually they're using the Section 232 investigations in situations where there is an area where the Americans would like to have more production in the United States, and they don't think that the reciprocal tariffs will necessarily be enough to accomplish their goals.
There are concerns that the Section 232 investigations currently underway on key materials such as copper and polysilicon may actually undermine the price competitiveness of key industries the U.S. seeks to promote, such as semiconductors. Would like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's hard to see how the U.S. Each one of these, for the most part, is an area where the Americans are not seeing the type of productivity and the type of output that they would like, and they're generally in areas where the Americans are very worried about becoming too dependent on other suppliers, particularly China. So, for example, right now the American electronics industry is not where the Americans would like it to be. And so they are very concerned, I think, about becoming too dependent on China for electronics. They're concerned about becoming too dependent on China for pharmaceuticals. And so I think, I think the notion that not taking action would be better for the Americans. I think the recent history shows, for the most part, that the current policies just aren't working very well. The Americans need to try something else.
Okay. We understand that you were involved in the renegotiation of the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement during the first Trump administration. What is your assessment of the future of the course FTA? Do you think the Trump administration would consider another renegotiation in addition to imposing reciprocal tariff?
Obviously, from a U.S. perspective, Korea negotiated 2 free trade agreements at the same time. They negotiated one with us and they negotiated one with the European Union. And now when you look at the 2 agreements, your trade with the EU is much more balanced than your trade with the United States. You have an enormous and growing trade surplus with the United States. So I think from the perspective of this administration, I don't think that deal has worked out in the way that we would have hoped. And I don't know that you're going to see a lot of enthusiasm for an expanded Korea free trade agreement, because we've tried that now for over 10 years, and from our perspective, it just hasn't had the results that we were hoping for.
Okay. Since the launch of President Trump's second term, the trade environment has been constantly evolving, and the Korean companies have had to respond with agility and foresight. Given that many companies operate production facilities across multiple countries and are entangled in complex supply chains for materials and components, we would appreciate your thoughts on what efforts Korean businesses should undertake in such a landscape.
Well, I think you do have to kind of recognize is that from an American perspective, the world really has to change. We have been having this debate internally over the United States for most of the last 15 years about how America can become more productive, how we can create better jobs, how we can create a higher living standard, how we can avoid being so far in debt. And for now, at least, the voters have selected Mr. Trump. So I think for the next few years, I think you can anticipate that the Trump team is going to be trying to encourage more production in the United States, more jobs in the United States, more supply chains running through the United States, and less dependence on imports. So that's certainly going to be their policy for the next few years, and I think any businesses is going to have to kind of sort of think about how that affects their strategy.
There are growing concerns that significant tariff increases could lead to upward pressure on consumer prices. What are the potential pros and cons of the supply chain realignment for the U.S. economy itself? How do you anticipate the Trump administration's trade policy will develop going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think so far we haven't really seen any significant inflationary effects here in the United States. Investors really don't seem very worried about what's happening here. I think the stock markets are close to all-time highs or at all-time highs. So I think you're starting to see a lot of optimism in the U.S. economy as people come to realize that the tariffs are not going to have as significant effect as some people had thought that they would. The U.S. just passed a new tax bill, which I think is also going to help the U.S. economy. And so I think you're going to see, most people now I think that the second half of the year is going to be pretty strong for the U.S. economy. And this, of course, will give President Trump more leverage in the trade negotiations because as his own economy continues to flourish and companies want more access to this market, he will use these opportunities to try to come up with trade terms that are more favorable for the Americans.
Under President Trump's second administration, which industries do you see as promising areas for U.S.-Korea cooperation? We'd like to hear your insights and potential opportunities for Korean companies.
The Americans are going to be looking for, a lot of different opportunities. Korea is a is a great country, which is extremely competitive in many areas. I think you're going to see, I think the U.S. is going to continue to be a very, very attractive market for a lot of products from around the world, including Korea. I think it would be a mistake for me to try to pick out specific industries. The business community in Korea is going to be much better at that than I would be. But I do think you can anticipate that the U.S. will be a very attractive and growing market.
For Korean companies that are already operating in the U.S. or are considering entry into the U.S. market, what capabilities or strategies do you believe are essential to navigate the Trump administration's trade policy environment?
I think the most important thing is for people to just kind of understand that they're very serious about this. They're not bluffing. They don't have some sort of a hidden agenda. They've been very clear. The current global trading system, whereby the United States always runs a very large current account deficit, has had significant negative effects on the U.S. economy and on the U.S. politically, and so they're going to try to make that change. Right now, they aren't getting a lot of cooperation from other countries, so they're acting unilaterally. I'm hopeful that as time goes on, other countries will take these concerns more seriously and will be able to get other countries to work with us. But I am absolutely certain that the Trump people will continue taking the measures that they think they need in order to create a more balanced trading system.
Okay, thanks so much, Mr. Bong, for sharing your perspective with us today. This has been a truly insightful conversation, and I'm sure our audience got a lot out of it. We really appreciate your time and look forward to continuing this discussion in the future. Thank you
very much.